Before we go any further into the dark, we want to thank Brian, who suggested this topic. If you guys have topics you want covered, make sure to leave them in the comments below. Now turn the lights down, if they are not down already. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let me take you into Hockomock Swamp. Before there was a conspiracy, there was a place, and the place came first by a very, very long way. Hockomock Swamp sits in the towns of Bridgewater, West Bridgewater, Raynham, Easton, and Norton, in Bristol and Plymouth counties, Massachusetts. It is the largest freshwater wetland in the state. It is a remnant of the last glaciation, a low bowl scraped out and left behind by ice that has been gone for more than 10,000 years, slowly filling with water and peat and cedar and thyme. It is not beautiful in the way a mountain is beautiful. It is beautiful in the way a very old face is beautiful. There is too much history in it for it to be simply pretty. The Wampanoag people knew this land long before any European saw it, and it is from their language that the swamp takes its name. Hockomock is often translated as the place where spirits dwell, and while translations across 4 centuries and 2 languages are always imperfect things, the general sense of it has never been in dispute. This was understood to be a place of power, a place where the ordinary rules of the ordinary world thinned out. The English colonists, arriving with their own theology and their own fears, translated that idea into the only vocabulary they had. They called it Devil's Swamp, and that single act of translation tells you almost everything about how the next 400 years would go. Because a place where spirits dwell is a place you approach with respect. A place called Devil's Swamp is a place you avoid, and then a place you fear, and then eventually a place you tell your children about in the dark to make them behave. Then came King Philip's War. Between 1675 and 1678, southeastern Massachusetts became the site of one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in the history of what would become the United States. The Wampanoag leader Metacomet, called King Philip by the English, led an alliance of native nations against colonial expansion. The war was catastrophic for both sides, and it was particularly catastrophic for the native peoples of the region, whose losses were so severe that the political landscape of New England never recovered its previous shape, and Hockomock Swamp was a refuge in that war. Its channels were impassable to soldiers who did not know them. Its islands of high ground hid families. Its silence hid movement. There were engagements fought in and around those wetlands, and there are places in that swamp where men died and were never recovered, because the swamp does not give things back. Peat preserves and peat swallows, both at once. So before a single modern story about lights or creatures or missing time was ever told, Hockomock Swamp was already a place where the ground held violence and grief and disappearance. That matters. It matters because folklore does not appear from nothing. It grows out of soil that has been prepared for it. Now move forward almost exactly 300 years. In the 1970s, a researcher named Loren Coleman was cataloguing strange reports across New England. Coleman was, and remains, one of the most recognisable figures in American cryptozoology, and he had a habit that most people in his field did not have. He mapped things, not just collected them, mapped them. And when he plotted southeastern Massachusetts reports onto a single map, he noticed something that had not been obvious when the reports were scattered across different newspapers, different decades, and different categories of weirdness. They clustered. Draw a line from Abington down to Freetown, across to Rehoboth and back up again, and you enclose roughly 200 square miles. Inside that shape, the density of anomalous reports was unusually high. Outside it, the density dropped away. Coleman gave the shape a name, the Bridgewater Triangle, and once a thing has a name, it has a life. What lives inside that name is one of the most genuinely strange collections of regional folklore anywhere in the country, not because any single report is unbeatable, but because of the variety. Most anomalous regions specialise. One place has lights, another has a lake creature, another has ghosts. The Bridgewater Triangle has everything. There are reports of unidentified aerial objects going back to at least 1960, when a local police officer described a glowing object over Bridgewater. There are reports of enormous birds, most famously the so-called Bridgewater Thunderbird, described by witnesses as having a wingspan somewhere between 8 and 12 feet, which is not a wingspan that any bird in New England is supposed to have. There are Bigfoot reports, which surprise people, because Bigfoot is supposed to be a Pacific Northwest phenomenon, and yet southeastern Massachusetts has produced hair-covered humanoid sightings for decades. There are ghost lights over the Raynham dog track. There are reports of a phantom hitchhiker on Route 44. There are stories out of the Freetown State Forest, which has its own extremely dark modern history, and which has drawn everything from occult rumour to genuine criminal investigation. There is Anawan Rock, where Metacomet's war captain finally surrendered, and where people have reported hearing voices in Algonquian on quiet nights, and seeing fires that leave no ash. There is Profile Rock, a natural formation that from the correct angle resembles a human face in stone. There are reports of giant snakes. There are reports of Pukwudgies, small humanoid figures from Wampanoag tradition, described as roughly 2 to 3 feet tall, capable of luring people to their deaths, and treated with genuine seriousness by people whose families have lived in that region for a very long time. And there are the animals, the mutilations, the cattle found in fields in the late 1970s, with wounds that local farmers insisted did not look like predator damage. All of it inside one triangle, all of it inside 200 square miles. Now, there are extremely reasonable explanations for a great deal of this, and I want to be fair to them, because I think being fair to the boring explanation is what makes the strange explanation worth listening to. Wetlands produce methane. Methane produces light under the right conditions. Decaying organic matter produces phosphorescence. Owls, particularly great horned owls, look impossibly large in poor light, and can produce vocalizations that sound genuinely wrong to a person who has never heard them before. Misjudging the size of a distant bird is one of the most common perceptual errors human beings make. Coyotes look strange in headlights. Deer stand up on their hind legs to reach branches, and a deer standing on its hind legs at dusk seen for half a second is a hair-covered humanoid. And clustering itself can be an illusion. If you draw a shape around a set of points after you have already seen where the points are, you can almost always make the shape look meaningful. Statisticians have a name for this. It is a well-documented cognitive trap, and it is the single strongest argument against every anomalous triangle anywhere in the world. I want you to hold both of those things at once tonight. The explanations are good, and the place is still strange. Because here is the thing that even the most rigorous skeptic tends to concede after a night in Hockomock swamp. It does not feel like other places. Sound behaves oddly there. The peat absorbs low frequencies and the water reflects high ones, so a noise from 200 yards away can arrive sounding like it came from 20 feet, and a noise from 20 feet can vanish entirely. The ground is unreliable, so distance is unreliable, so time is unreliable, because we measure walking time in confident steps, and the swamp does not permit confident steps. There is genuine iron in the local geology, enough that compass variation has been noted in parts of southeastern Massachusetts, and there is the fog. Hockomock produces fog the way other places produce weather. It comes up out of the water in the evening, and it does not roll in from somewhere else. It simply appears, forming in place, and it can reduce visibility from 400 yards to 4 feet in the span of a few minutes. So imagine you are a person in that swamp at dusk. Sound is lying to you. Distance is lying to you. Your compass is drifting. Fog is closing. And every story you were ever told about that place, from the Wampanoag warning to the colonial curse to the 1970s newspaper article about the Thunderbird, is sitting somewhere in the back of your skull. You do not need anything supernatural to be frightened in Hockomock Swamp, but you might need something supernatural to explain what happened to the Bellamy family. and that is where the real history ends and the story begins. In March of 1954, a small federal geological team arrived in southeastern Massachusetts with 3 trucks, a trailer of equipment, and paperwork describing a mineral resource survey. This was not unusual. The early 1950s were a golden age of American ground surveying. The country was mapping itself with an enthusiasm bordering on obsession, looking for uranium, for iron, for water tables, for anything that could be counted and claimed. Teams like this one moved through rural New England constantly, and the people who lived there had long since stopped finding them interesting. The team leader was a geophysicist named Amos Vane. He was 36 years old. He had spent the war doing submarine detection work, which is a very specific kind of profession, and it left him with a very specific kind of mind. Amos Vane had spent 4 years learning to trust instruments over intuition, because in submarine detection, intuition gets people killed, and instruments do not. He was, by every account in this story, a careful man. The survey began on the western edge of the swamp and worked east. Magnetometer readings, taken on a grid logged by hand, entered into a bound notebook at the end of each day. Tedious work. Cold work. In March, in a Massachusetts wetland, where the water had not fully let go of winter, and the mud pulled at boots with what felt like personal intent. For the first 9 days the readings were ordinary. Local iron content, some glacial deposition, nothing that would justify the paperwork. On the 10th day, the needle moved. It did not spike. That is the part Vane would emphasize later, in the notebook that his family kept for 40 years without ever fully reading. A spike would have meant a discrete deposit, a lump of ore, a boulder of magnetite. A spike was normal. This was a curve. The magnetic anomaly rose smoothly as the team moved east, held steady across a wide plateau, and then fell away just as smoothly on the other side. It had edges. Geology does not usually have edges. Vane widened the survey. Over the following 2 weeks, working through mud and cold in the beginnings of blackfly season, his team mapped the outline of whatever was producing the anomaly. It was circular, not roughly circular, not oval, not the vague blob shape of a natural deposit. Circular, to a degree of regularity that Vane described in his notebook, using a phrase that his family would later find genuinely upsetting. He wrote that the edge deviated from a perfect circle by less than the margin of error of his own instruments, which is another way of saying that his instruments were not precise enough to find a flaw in it. He estimated the diameter at slightly under half a mile, and then he ordered seismic testing. Seismic testing in 1954 was a blunt instrument. You put an explosive charge in the ground, you set it off, you listen with geophones to how the shock wave travels and reflects, and from the timing of the returns you build a rough picture of the layers beneath you. Soft sediment returns slowly. Bedrock returns fast. It is like tapping a wall to find the studs, except the wall is the planet. They set the charges, they listened, and the return came back wrong. The upper layers behaved exactly as expected. Peat, then sand and glacial till, then the deep ancient granite bedrock of New England, which is some of the oldest exposed stone on the continent, and then, at a depth Vane calculated at approximately 900 feet, the signal hit something that returned faster than granite, considerably faster. He reran the test. Different charge placement, different geophone array, different technician recording the results so that his own expectations could not contaminate the data. Same result. Something roughly half a mile wide, 900 feet beneath Hockomock Swamp, denser and harder and more acoustically reflective than the bedrock it was sitting inside, and perfectly circular. There is a line in his notebook, written that evening in a hand noticeably less controlled than the rest of the page. He wrote, "That is not geology." He telephoned his supervising office the following morning and reported the anomaly through official channels, exactly as procedure required. 48 hours later, 3 men arrived from Washington. They were extremely polite. They complimented the quality of the survey work. They explained that the anomaly was almost certainly a magnetite intrusion of a type recently documented elsewhere, and that the seismic returns were likely a multiple reflection artifact, which is a real phenomenon and a plausible thing to say. Then they collected every notebook, every magnetometer tape, every seismic trace, and every photograph. They collected the geophones. They collected the equipment inventory. And they informed Dr. Amos Vane and his four-man team that the survey was being reassigned to another office, and that their participation was concluded, and that the entire project was now classified at a level none of them held. Vane signed the paperwork. Everyone did. This was 1954, and men who had spent the war in uniform did not argue with men from Washington. He went home to Rhode Island. He returned to ordinary work, and for the rest of his professional life, whenever anyone asked him about southeastern Massachusetts, he said there was nothing there but mud. The survey does not appear in any published geological record of the region. The expedition does not appear in the annual reports of the office that funded it. The 4 technicians who worked under Vane were reassigned to 3 separate states within the year, and somewhere in a filing system that would not be meaningfully digitized for another 4 decades, a new program was opened, with a budget line so small it would never draw attention, and a designation so bland that a clerk could read it 100 times without registering it. Project Crossroad. 24 years passed. Now let me take you to the Bellamy place because you should know what it looked like before it stopped making sense. The property sat on the eastern edge of a town I'm not going to name precisely, on a road that dead-ended into conservation land. 11 acres, a farmhouse built in stages across 130 years, so that the floors did not quite agree with each other and every doorway had its own personality. A barn that had been converted badly into a workshop. A chicken run. A pasture with 4 cows in it that were there for milk and sentiment rather than for any serious agricultural reason. And at the back of the property, past the pasture fence, past a low stone wall built by somebody's great-grandfather out of rocks pulled from a field that had long since gone back to forest, the land stopped being property and started being swamp. Gideon Bellamy was 44 years old in the autumn of 1978. He repaired small engines, lawn tractors, outboard motors, generators, chainsaws, snowblowers, anything with a carburetor and a grudge. People brought him their broken machines and he fixed them in the converted barn, and he was good enough at it that he never had to advertise. He was a quiet man who was not shy, which is a distinction worth making. He simply did not see the point of most conversation. His hands were always slightly stained, and his hearing in his left ear was not what it had been, and he had a habit of standing very still when he was thinking, which people sometimes mistook for anger. His wife Elaine worked at the elementary school, not as a teacher. She ran the front office, which in a small school means she ran the school. She knew every child's name, every parent's marital situation, and every teacher's coping mechanism. She was the one who talked at dinner. She was the one who remembered birthdays. She was the reason the household functioned. They had 2 children. Caleb was 18. He had graduated in June and had not yet done anything about it, which was a source of low-grade tension in the house. He was not lazy. He was interested in things, intensely and narrowly, and none of the things he was interested in looked like a career. Mostly he was interested in photography. He had bought a used single-lens reflex camera with money from a summer job, and had converted a closet into a darkroom, and he spent an unreasonable amount of his time and money on film. Mara was 13. She was the smart one, which everyone in the family knew and nobody said out loud. She read constantly. She kept notebooks. She had the particular unnerving quality that some 13-year-olds have of noticing the thing the adults in the room are carefully not saying. And all 4 of them knew the swamp, not as a landmark, as a neighbour. They knew that the peepers started in late March, and that the sound was so loud in April you had to close the windows. They knew which corner of the pasture flooded first. They knew that the barred owls called across the water at night in a rhythm that sounded, if you were half asleep, almost exactly like a question. They knew where the deer trails came out of the tree line. They knew that in November the whole thing went quiet and grey, and stayed that way until the light came back. You cannot overstate how important this is to what follows. The Bellamys were not tourists who wandered into an unfamiliar wetland and got frightened by an owl. They were people who had spent their entire lives listening to one specific piece of ground, which is precisely why they noticed when it changed. It began, as far as anyone could reconstruct afterward, in early September of 1978, with the lights. Gideon saw them first, and his first reaction was completely mundane. He assumed they were helicopters. There is a Coast Guard air station in the region. There are hospitals with medical flights. There is general aviation traffic. A light moving over a wetland at night is one of the least remarkable things a person can see in that part of the country. And for about 2 weeks, Gideon Bellamy noticed the lights the way you notice a train you have heard every night since childhood. Then, on the 22nd of September, he was out in the yard late, and one of them came close enough for him to look at properly. And he realised he could not hear it. Not faintly, not distantly, at all. A helicopter at that distance should have been a physical experience. You feel a helicopter in your sternum before you identify it with your ears. This was silent. He stood in the yard and watched the light move across the top of the swamp at what he estimated was 200 feet, and the only sound in the entire world was his own breathing and the cows shifting in the pasture behind him. Then he noticed the second thing, and the second thing was worse, because the second thing was not about the light at all. It was about the trees. The light was passing over a section of cedar and red maple. It was bright, it was close, and the trees underneath it were not lit. He said afterward that it took him almost a full minute to understand what he was looking at, because the human brain does not have a shelf for that information. Light illuminates things. That is the entire job description of light. A bright object 200 feet above a forest should throw a moving pool of brightness across the canopy, and the canopy should ripple with it, and the shadow should swing. Nothing swung. The canopy stayed black. The light was up there, visibly, undeniably, and it was not shining down on anything. It was as though he were looking at a bright object on the far side of a pane of glass. Or, and this is the thought he had at the time and never quite managed to get rid of, as though the light were not actually up there at all, and what he was seeing was a reflection of something else, something below. He did not tell Elaine that night. He went inside, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lamp off, and he decided that he had been tired and that the angle had been strange. That is what reasonable people do. That is what reasonable people do right up until the animals start telling them otherwise. The cows went first. There were 4 of them, and they had grazed the eastern corner of that pasture every day of their lives because that was where the grass was best and where the shade came in the afternoon. In the last week of September, they stopped. Not dramatically. There was no panic. They simply grazed the western half of the field, and when they reached the invisible line where they had decided to stop, they turned around and walked back. Gideon drove them east himself, on foot, the way you do. They went, unwillingly, ears back, heads low, and the moment he stopped pushing, they came back past him at a fast walk. Then, the dogs. The Bellamys had 2, a shepherd mix named Roscoe, and something small and disreputable named Pilot. Both of them had spent years going in and out of the tree line, chasing things they never caught. They stopped going in. They would go to the stone wall, they would put their front paws up on it, and they would stand there facing east and whine, not bark, whine, continuously, for minutes at a time until someone called them back. Roscoe developed a habit of sleeping against the back door with his body physically blocking it, which he had never done in his life. Then the birds. This was the one that Mara noticed, because Mara noticed everything, and because in late September and early October southeastern Massachusetts sits underneath one of the great migratory flyways of the North American continent. Every autumn, the sky above that swamp fills with movement. Geese in their ragged arrowheads, blackbirds in clouds so dense they look like smoke, warblers moving at night in numbers no one on the ground can see, Mara kept a notebook of them, because she was the kind of child who kept notebooks, and in the first week of October, her notebook stops describing birds and starts describing a shape. Over one particular section of the swamp, roughly 1.5 miles east, the flocks were breaking. Not scattering, which is what a flock does when a hawk arrives. Breaking. A skein of geese would come in from the north, holding a perfect line, and as it approached that section it would bend. The lead bird would turn. The whole formation would swing around the area, sometimes by as much as 1/4 mile, and then reassemble on the far side and continue south as though nothing had happened. She recorded it 11 separate times in 9 days, always the same section, always the same direction of turn. Her notes are almost unbearably matter-of-fact in the way that 13-year-old notes often are. She simply writes down what happened, over and over, with times and approximate headings, and never once speculates about why, except on the last page of that particular sequence, where she wrote a single line underneath the final entry. She wrote, "They know where it is." Then, the compasses. Gideon kept a compass in the workshop because in that part of the world property lines are described in bearings and old deeds have to be argued with occasionally. In the second week of October, he was setting a fence post and he noticed the needle was reading 4 degrees off from where he expected. He assumed the compass had been dropped. He got the spare from the truck. The spare read the same. He walked in a slow circle around the property, checking every 50 paces, and he found that as he moved east toward the stone wall, the deviation increased. At the wall, both compasses were reading between 6 and 8 degrees off from true. Then he walked back to the house, and by the time he reached the porch, the needles had settled to normal. He did it 3 more times over the next 2 days. Twice he found the same drift. Once he found nothing at all. Perfect readings, all the way to the wall. That is the detail I want you to sit with, because it is the detail that separates this from a story about a big magnet in the ground. It came and went. Whatever was underneath that swamp was not simply present. It was doing something. Sometimes. Caleb went in on the afternoon of October 17th. He told his mother he was going to photograph the full colour, which was true in the sense that he did bring a camera, and it was in fact the peak of full colour. It was not true in any of the ways that mattered. He had heard his father describe the light that did not illuminate the trees. He had watched the dogs at the wall. He had read his sister's notebook without asking, which is what older brothers do. He was 18, and he had a camera, and there was something in the swamp. He went in at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, on a clear cold day, in good light, following a deer trail he'd used since he was 9 years old. He was wearing a wristwatch. That will matter. He walked, by his own account, for about 15 minutes. He knew the ground. The trail runs along a low ridge of firmer soil for perhaps 1/2 mile, then splits, and the left branch goes toward a stand of white cedar, where the water gets deep enough that you have to pick your way from hummock to hummock. He took the left branch, and about 5 minutes past the split the sound stopped. He described it later in almost exactly the same terms his father had used, which is one of the small details that made investigators take the family seriously. Neither of them was reaching for poetry. They both said the same flat thing. The sound did not fade. It stopped. One step, there were red-winged blackbirds and water and wind in dry leaves. The next step, there was nothing. He said his ears popped, the way they do in an elevator. He said the light changed, and when pressed on this, he had difficulty explaining it. It did not get darker. It got, in his words, flatter. Shadows lost their edges. The contrast dropped, the way it does in fog, except there was no fog. He stood still for a while, and then he noticed the building. It was perhaps 80 yards ahead of him, standing between the cedar trunks on ground that he knew for a fact was under 2 feet of standing water. It was made of stone. Fieldstone, the same grey granite as every colonial foundation in New England, laid in the same rough courses. It was 2 stories. It had a peaked roof of dark slate. It had a chimney. At first glance, and this is what he kept saying, at first glance it looked completely ordinary. It looked like a house from 1690. It looked like something you would drive past on a back road in Rhode Island without turning your head. And then he looked at it properly. The windows were wrong. They were tall and narrow, and there were too many of them, spaced at intervals that did not correspond to any interior arrangement he could imagine. They were not glazed. They were simply openings, and they were black, and the blackness in them did not vary with the angle at which he looked at them. The door was worse. The doorway was almost 9 feet tall. Not a doorway made tall by a raised threshold or a decorative arch. A doorway proportioned, correctly and deliberately, for something 9 feet tall to walk through without ducking. Everything about the building was scaled to that door. Once he saw it, the whole structure resolved, the way one of those drawings resolves from a vase into 2 faces. It was not a colonial house with a strange door. It was a building for something else, built by something that had seen colonial houses. He raised the camera. He took 4 photographs. He remembers the sound of the shutter being enormously loud, which is exactly what a shutter sounds like in total silence, and on the 4th frame, as he was winding on, he heard his father screaming his name. He turned around. Gideon was standing 50 yards behind him on the trail, with a flashlight in the dark. It was 10:20 at night. 7 hours had passed. Caleb's watch said 3:34. It was still running. It was not broken. It had not stopped. From that moment forward it kept perfect time, and it stayed exactly 6 hours and 46 minutes behind every other clock in the house for the rest of the time he owned it. Elaine had called the police at 7. There were men from 3 departments in the swamp by 9. There was a search line. There were lights. Nobody had seen him, and Caleb had been standing on a trail 500 yards from his own back pasture, in an area that 2 separate search teams had walked directly past for 7 hours. He was not cold. That is another detail that stuck. It was a clear October night in Massachusetts, and the temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and he had been out in a light jacket, and he was not cold. He was not hungry. He was not disoriented in the way lost people are disoriented. He was simply, calmly, absolutely certain that he had been gone for 20 minutes. The doctor at the hospital in Brockton found nothing. Normal vitals, normal neurological exam, no sign of head trauma, no sign of any substance, no sign of a seizure. The only thing he noted, and he noted it as a curiosity rather than a finding, was that Caleb's pupils were slightly slow to respond to light. By the next morning they were normal. The family did what families do. They decided it had been a blackout of some kind. Low blood sugar. A strange fugue. They decided to keep an eye on him. And then Caleb developed the film. He did it that night, in the closet darkroom, alone, at 2 a.m, because he could not sleep and because he had to know. The first 3 frames were full colour. Maple, water, a heron, ordinary, beautiful, absolutely unremarkable. The 4th frame was the building. It was in focus. It was correctly exposed. It filled the centre of the frame with the cedar trunks framing it on both sides, and every detail he remembered was there. The stone, the tall, narrow windows, the 9-foot door. He hung it to dry, and he sat on the floor of that closet and looked at it for a very long time. The next morning, at first light, the entire family walked out to the site. Gideon had a chainsaw and a length of rope, and he flagged the trail as he went with orange tape, which he had never once bothered to do in 20 years of walking that swamp. They found the split in the trail. They took the left branch. They walked 5 minutes. They walked 10. They found the cedar stand. They found the standing water. 2 feet deep, black with tannin, absolutely still. They found no building, no foundation, no stone, no rubble, no clearing, no disturbance of any kind in ground so soft that a raccoon leaves a signature. Nothing but cedar and water and the sound of red-winged blackbirds which had come back. They searched for 6 hours. Mara found one thing. She was the one who found it because she was the one looking down instead of ahead, and because she was 13 and had not yet learned that adults get to decide what counts as evidence. Pressed into the wet peat at the edge of the cedar stand, at the exact spot where the photograph would have been taken from, there was a footprint. Not a bare foot, not a boot with a tread. something flat and hard-soled and roughly 18 inches long. Nobody in that family wore anything close to an 18-inch shoe. Nobody in that family had been standing there, and whatever had made it had been standing exactly where Caleb had been standing, facing the same direction, behind him. Elaine Bellamy was the one who took the photograph to somebody who knew things. Gideon wanted to burn it. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a figure of speech. He said, more than once in the days that followed, that the picture was the problem, and that if the picture went away, then his son would stop looking at it, and the whole business would settle. Elaine understood something he did not. The picture was not the problem. The picture was the only piece of the problem that could be examined. She worked at a school. Schools have connections to other schools. Through a chain of favours that took about 10 days, she got the photograph in front of a professor of botany at a university in the Boston area, on the pretext of identifying an unusual tree. She did not tell him where it was taken. She did not tell him about her son. She told him it was a photograph a student had found, and she was curious about the vegetation. He looked at it for less than a minute before he asked her where she'd gotten it. She said Massachusetts. He said no. He said it politely, the way an expert says no when he is certain and is trying not to be rude about it. And then he put the print down on the desk and turned on a lamp and started pointing. The trees framing the building were not white cedar. They were not any conifer native to New England. The bark structure was wrong. The branching habit was wrong. The needle arrangement, insofar as it could be resolved at that magnification, was wrong. And the size was very wrong. Using the doorway as a scale reference, which he did without knowing that the doorway was itself impossible, he estimated the nearest trunks at between 6 and 7 feet in diameter. There is nothing that big in Massachusetts. There has not been anything that big in Massachusetts since the colonial period cleared the old growth, and even then the historical record of New England's original forest does not describe conifers of that habit. He told her that if she had said the photograph was from the Pacific Northwest, he would have believed her, except the branching was still wrong. Then he said the thing that Elaine wrote down in the car afterward, sitting in a parking garage with her hands shaking, because she wanted to have it exactly right. He said that the closest match he could offer, and he stressed that it was not a match, was to certain fossil conifers, species that occur in the pollen record of the region, species that have not grown in New England since the end of the last glaciation, approximately 10,000 years ago. He said it as an academic curiosity. He was smiling when he said it. He thought it was an interesting photographic puzzle, and probably a very good hoax. He asked if he could keep a copy for a colleague. Elaine said no. She took the print, and she thanked him, and she went out to the car and she sat in that parking garage for 45 minutes before she felt able to drive. Caleb found the figure 8 days after that. He had been enlarging sections of the negative one at a time. He did not have good equipment. He had a cheap enlarger and a lot of patience, and he worked through the frame in a grid, quadrant by quadrant, because he had decided that if there was anything else in that picture, he was going to find it. He found it in the lower right, in the shadow line where the building's wall met the tree cover. At normal size, it read as a dark vertical smudge, a trunk, a gap between branches, absolutely nothing. At 6 times enlargement, it had shoulders. At 12, it had a head. It was standing perhaps 20 feet to the right of the doorway, partially behind a trunk in shadow. The grain of the film at that magnification turns everything into a storm of grey dots, and you can convince yourself of almost anything in film grain, and Caleb knew that, and he spent 2 more weeks trying to convince himself that was what was happening. But it had proportions. Using the doorway again as a reference, the figure was roughly 7 feet tall. Its shoulders were narrow relative to its height. Its arms were long. Its head was small and smooth and, as far as anything could be resolved, featureless, though at that grain a face would have been lost anyway. It was not moving. The exposure was 125th of a second, fast enough to freeze a walking person, and there was no blur. It was standing still, and it was oriented toward the camera. Caleb printed that enlargement, and he put it in a drawer, and he did not show it to his family for almost a month. When he finally did, on a Tuesday night in November, his father looked at it for a long time. Then Gideon Bellamy went out to the workshop and did not come back until 3 a.m, and in the morning there was a bolt on the inside of every exterior door in that house. The trucks came on the 19th of November, 3 of them. 2 crew cab pickups and a box truck, all with the correct kind of state and federal decals, all with the correct kind of tired-looking men getting out of them. They set up in the town's public works yard, which is exactly where you set up if you want people to assume you are boring. They knocked on doors along the road, and they were polite, and they explained that they were conducting a groundwater contamination study related to historical industrial discharge in the watershed. They handed out a photocopied one-page information sheet with a telephone number on it that, when Elaine tried it in December, rang in an office in Virginia, and was answered by a woman who said only the last 4 digits of the number back to her. They asked for permission to access the conservation land behind the Bellamy property. Gideon said yes, because saying no would have been strange, and because he wanted to see what they did. Here is what he saw. They carried Geiger counters. Now a groundwater study might involve radiological survey. That is not unheard of. But the men were carrying them switched on, held low, sweeping side to side as they walked, in a pattern that had nothing to do with sampling and everything to do with searching. They carried magnetometers, portable ones, chest-mounted, with a sensor on a boom. They carried military radios. Gideon had spent enough time around surplus equipment to know a field radio when he saw one, and he knew that the model they were carrying was not something you bought at a hardware store. They carried sidearms, every one of them, and they did not take a single water sample. Not one. Gideon watched them for 4 days from the pasture with a pair of binoculars, and in 4 days, not one man in that crew ever knelt down at the water's edge, or opened a sample bottle, or wrote a label. They walked grids, they read instruments, they spoke into radios, and every evening at dusk they came out of the swamp at exactly the same place, and they counted each other before they got in the trucks. The man in charge was named Warren Kessler. He came to the house on the 22nd alone in the early evening, and he knocked on the front door instead of the kitchen door, which is how the family knew immediately that he was not local. He was somewhere in his 50s, grey, neat, unremarkable in a way that felt almost professionally maintained. He wore a canvas jacket over a shirt and tie, and he had the manner of a man who had spent his entire career being underestimated on purpose. He asked if he could come in. Elaine said yes before Gideon could say no. He sat at their kitchen table, and he accepted coffee, and then he said something that stopped the room. He said, "I'd like to talk about the 17th of October." Nobody had told him about the 17th of October. The police report existed, technically. A missing juvenile call that resolved the same night generates paperwork in a small department, and then that paperwork goes into a drawer forever. It had not been in a newspaper. There had been no reason for anyone outside that town to know it had happened, and there had been considerably less reason for a groundwater contractor to know. Kessler did not explain how he knew. He asked Caleb, very gently and very precisely, a series of questions. He asked whether the sound had stopped gradually or all at once. He asked whether his ears had popped. He asked whether the light had changed in brightness or in contrast. He asked whether his watch had continued running. He asked whether he had smelled anything. That was the one that unsettled Caleb most, because he had not mentioned it to anybody. There had been a smell, faint and hard to name. He had settled privately on the phrase hot stone, the smell of a granite ledge in August after a rainstorm. When he said it, Kessler wrote it down. He did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. And then Warren Kessler closed his notebook and told the Bellamy family that their son had almost certainly experienced a temporary neurological event brought on by exposure to naturally occurring swamp gas, that such events were more common than people realized, that the photograph was likely a double exposure, and that they should not discuss the matter with anyone because it would only invite the kind of attention that made property difficult to sell. Then he thanked them for the coffee, and he left. Caleb went into the field station 11 days later. I want to be honest with you about how ordinary this was, because in the retelling it sounds like a heist, and it was not. The public works yard had a chain-link fence with a gate that was padlocked at night and open during the day. The field station was a construction trailer. The trailer had a door with a knob lock, the kind you can open with a driver's license, and Caleb Bellamy had been repairing small engines alongside his father since he was 11 years old and had a very practical relationship with hardware. He went in at 9 in the evening on a Saturday in December when the crew was at a motel in Raynham and the yard was empty and there was 6 inches of snow that made the whole town quiet. He was inside for under 15 minutes. He had his camera. There were folding tables with equipment cases. There were logbooks he did not have time to read. There was a coffee maker and a space heater and a calendar from a hardware store, all of the ordinary sediment of men working somewhere they do not live. And on the long wall there was a map. It was a United States Geological Survey topographic sheet of southeastern Massachusetts, 4 of them actually, taped together and mounted on a sheet of plywood, covering an area considerably larger than the swamp. It was covered in pins, hundreds of them, 5 colours, and down in the corner, on an index card taped to the plywood, was a legend written in ballpoint pen in a small tidy hand. Red was aerial phenomena, green was biological anomaly, yellow was missing persons, blue was electromagnetic event, and white was a phrase that Caleb read 4 times before he photographed it, because he wanted to be sure he was reading it correctly in bad light. White was temporal displacement. He photographed the map in sections, 6 frames working left to right with the flash bouncing off the plastic map cover and ruining 2 of them. And then he found his own pin. It was white. It was set into the map at a location that was, as near as he could judge, precisely where he had been standing when he took the photograph. There was a paper tag on it, the size of a fingernail, with a designation written on it in the same tidy ballpoint hand. It read, Event 78-41. He stood there in the dark trailer in the snow-quiet town and did the arithmetic. 78 was the year, 41 was not. 41 meant that in the 10.5 months before Caleb Bellamy walked into Hockomock swamp with a camera around his neck, 40 other events had been catalogued, tagged and mapped by men who had been in that region long enough to have a system for it. 40 that year alone. And somebody had been keeping this map for a very long time, because when Caleb looked closely at the plywood, he could see the ghost outlines of older pinholes, thousands of them, layer upon layer, going back decades, until the surface of the board was more hole than board. Dr. Celia Wren contacted the family in January of 1979. She did it in the most careful way imaginable. She did not knock on the door. She did not telephone the house. She waited outside the elementary school at the end of a Thursday in a rented car, and when Elaine came out into the parking lot, she rolled down the window and said, "I work with Warren Kessler, and I need you to not react." Elaine got in the car. Wren was 39. She had a doctorate in physics from a university she never named to them, and she had come to Project Crossroad in 1974 from a background in geophysical instrumentation, which is a polite way of saying she had spent her 20s designing sensors for things the government did not talk about. She was not a whistleblower in the modern sense. She did not want a newspaper. She was not trying to bring anything down. She was, by her own description, trying to make sure that at least one family outside the program understood what had happened to them, because she had watched the program lie to 11 previous families, and she had reached the end of what she could carry. She met with the Bellamys 6 times over the following 14 months, always away from the house, always in daylight, always with a rule that Gideon found both absurd and eventually entirely reasonable, which was that nobody was permitted to write anything down while she was speaking. Here is what she told them. The first thing she said was that the government had been watching Hockomock Swamp continuously since 1954, not intermittently, not as a curiosity, continuously for 25 years, with a permanent budget line, a rotating staff, and a record system that had outlived 4 presidential administrations. The second thing she said was that she would not use the word paranormal, and she asked them not to use it either. Not because she was dismissive, because she said the word paranormal does not describe a phenomenon. It describes a filing decision. It is the drawer you put something in when you have decided not to study it. She had another term. She called them overlap events. And then she explained the single insight that Project Crossroad had been built around, which is, in my opinion, the most genuinely unsettling idea in this entire story. For most of the 20th century, she said, strange things happening in southeastern Massachusetts were reported into 4 completely separate systems. If you saw a light in the sky, you called the Air Force or the state police, and your report went into an aerial phenomena file, where it was assessed by people whose entire training was in aircraft identification. If you saw an animal you could not identify, you called animal control or a game warden or a newspaper, and your report was handled by people whose entire framework was zoological. It was a bear, it was a coyote, it was an escaped exotic, it was a hoax. If a person went missing, you called the police, and the report went into a criminal and welfare framework, where the questions are about family conflict and debt and drowning and foul play. And if your lights flickered, or your car died, or your compass turned, you called the power company or a mechanic, and the report went nowhere at all, because that is not a report, that is a Tuesday. 4 systems, 4 vocabularies, 4 sets of professionals, none of whom ever read each other's files, because why would they? Wren said that this was not a conspiracy. This is the part where I think she was probably telling the truth, and it is the part that has always made this story feel plausible to me, even at its most outlandish. It was not a cover-up. It was just bureaucracy. Information does not travel sideways in institutions. It travels up, gets summarised, and stops. And so, for 50 years, the Bridgewater Triangle produced an enormous body of evidence that was by design unreadable, because it had been shredded across 4 filing systems the moment each piece entered the record. Project Crossroads' founding act in 1955 was very simple and very boring. Somebody bought a map. They put every report on it. All 4 categories, no filtering, no assessment, no dismissal. If a farmer in Raynham said his cows would not go in a field, that got a pin. If a driver on Route 106 said his engine died, that got a pin. If a hunter said he saw a bird the size of a car, that got a pin. And when they stepped back, they saw what Loren Coleman would independently notice 20 years later with far less data. The pins clustered. But Crossroad had something Coleman did not have, which was the 1954 seismic survey. So they knew what the pins were clustering around. Wren drew it for them, on a paper napkin, in a diner outside Taunton, and then she tore the napkin up before they left. Distance from the anomaly, on one axis. Number of reports on the other. It was not a scatter, it was a curve. A clean, steep, absolutely regular fall-off, of the kind that any physicist recognises instantly, because it is the shape that every field in the universe makes as it weakens with distance. The reports were not distributed randomly across a region. They were radiating from a point, and the point was 900 feet under Hockomock Swamp. Then she told them about the pulse. Beginning in 1959, Crossroad had permanent magnetometers in the swamp disguised as survey markers and water monitoring stations. By 1978 there were 16 of them, plus seismometers, plus atmospheric sensors, plus, though she did not say this directly, some things she declined to describe at all. And what those instruments recorded over 19 years was a rhythm. Every so often the structure discharged. Wren was careful about that word. She said discharge because she did not want to say emit, and she did not want to say emit because emission implies a source generating energy, and she had come to believe that was not what was happening. The event lasted between 4 and 11 minutes. During it, the local magnetic field distorted by an amount that, in her words, should have required a fault in the instruments, and did not, because 16 separate instruments do not develop the same fault simultaneously. The intervals were irregular, sometimes 11 weeks, sometimes 7 months, sometimes 2 events 9 days apart. Crossroad had spent 2 decades trying to find the pattern and had never found it. And Wren said this with a specific kind of professional frustration that Gideon recognised from his own work. It is the frustration of a person who is certain there is a mechanism and cannot get at it. But the correlation with reports was overwhelming. In the 72 hours following a discharge, reports inside the triangle increased by a factor that Wren gave as somewhere between 8 and 14, depending on how you counted. Everything increased. Lights, creatures, missing time, animal behaviour, vehicle failures, compass drift. All 4 categories at once, all rising together and then falling together, and then the region going quiet again for weeks or months. This is the point where the entire architecture of the story clicks into place. Because for 100 years, everybody investigating the Bridgewater Triangle had been asking the wrong question. They had been asking, why does this area have so many different kinds of strangeness? And the answer, if Wren was right, was that it does not have many kinds of strangeness. It has one phenomenon producing 4 different symptoms, filed in 4 different drawers by 4 different professions, none of whom ever compared notes. The lights were not a separate thing from the creatures. The creatures were not a separate thing from the missing time. The missing time was not a separate thing from the compass drift. They were all the same event, seen from 4 angles by 4 kinds of witness, and reported into 4 systems built to guarantee that no one would ever see the whole shape. Wren had a word for what she thought was happening, and it was not a word from physics. She said leakage. She said that if you have 2 containers, and something goes wrong with the wall between them, you do not get a door, you get a leak. And what comes through a leak is not chosen. It is whatever happened to be near the wall at the moment it failed. A bird, a machine, an animal, a person, light, weather. She said the reason the Bridgewater Triangle produces such an absurd variety of nonsense is precisely because nobody is choosing what comes through. And then she said the thing that Elaine Bellamy repeated to her daughter 20 years later, on the last night of her life, in a hospital room in Taunton. She said, "We are not being visited." She said, "We are leaking." There is a question that Gideon Bellamy asked at the 3rd meeting, and it is the question I would have asked, and it turned out to be the most important one anybody in this story ever asked. He said, "Why is it a triangle?" Because it is a fair question. If you have a single point source under a swamp, and the effect falls off with distance, you should get a circle. Fields make circles. Everything makes circles. You do not get a triangle. Wren did not answer him for 2 months. At the 4th meeting she came back with an answer, and the answer was that there was more than one. Crossroad had run confirmatory seismic work in 1961, and again in 1971, moving outward from Hockomock, looking for the edges of the anomaly. They found 2 more, both smaller, both deeper, both, within the limits of the instrumentation, circular. One roughly beneath the northern reach of the region, near the Abington corner, one roughly beneath the southeastern reach, in the direction of Freetown. 3 anomalies, 3 corners, and Hockomock, the largest by a factor of 4, sitting almost exactly at the centroid. Wren's working model, which she was careful to present as a model and not a fact, was that the 3 structures were not independent. She believed they were coupled, the way 3 tuning forks in a room are coupled, and that the discharges were not local events but system events, and that the reason nobody could find a pattern in the timing was that they had been analysing one node of a 3-node system as though it were the whole thing. When the 3 came into phase, she said, the field between them was not a simple sum. It was an interference pattern, and an interference pattern between 3 sources has a shape. It has lobes and nulls, places where the effect reinforces and places where it cancels, and the geometry of those lobes depends on the geometry of the sources. 3 sources at the corners of a triangle produce reinforcement along the edges and at the centre, which is, if you go back and look at the pin map, exactly where the reports are, not evenly spread across 200 square miles, concentrated along the boundaries and clustered at the middle. Loren Coleman drew a triangle around southeastern Massachusetts because that was the simplest shape that enclosed the data. Wren's suggestion was that the shape was not a convenience. The shape was the machine. Now let us talk about the creatures, because this is where Project Crossroads stopped being an interesting anomaly program and became something that frightened the people running it. Crossroad had photographs, not many. Wren was specific about that, and I think it lends the whole thing credibility, because the temptation in a story like this is to claim a vault full of clear pictures. She said the program had accumulated in 24 years 11 photographic captures that survived internal review out of thousands of camera hours. Most of them were poor. 3 were not. 1 showed a bird. It had been taken in 1966 by an automatic camera on a pole at the edge of the swamp, triggered by a tripline, and it caught the animal in level flight at an estimated 40 feet from the lens. Wren said the analysts had spent a year on wingspan estimation and had settled on a figure between 9 and 11 feet, with the caveat that the reference objects and frame were themselves uncertain. She said the skeletal proportions were wrong for any North American raptor. She said that the closest structural analogue anyone in the program had proposed was a teratorn, a family of enormous birds that lived in the Americas and went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. 1 showed a humanoid. 1971. At night. Infrared. Terrible quality. Hair covering. Estimated height between 7 and 8 feet. Bipedal, with a gait that the analysts described in the driest possible language as inconsistent with human locomotion. And 1 showed something that Wren refused to describe to the Bellamys at all. She said only that it was taken in 1973, that 4 people had reviewed it, and that 2 of them had subsequently requested transfer out of the program. But photographs are arguments, and Wren was not interested in arguments. She was interested in samples, and Crossroad had samples. Hair, mostly. Recovered from bark, from fence wire, from the edges of trail cameras. Scat, twice. Tissue, once, from a cow in Rehoboth in 1977 that had died in a way the state veterinarian classified as predation by an unidentified animal, and then declined to discuss further. The samples went to a laboratory that Wren identified only by a contract number, and the results, which came back over a period of years, were the reason Project Crossroads' entire theoretical framework had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Because the samples were not from unknown animals, they were from known animals, almost. Wren explained it to the Bellamys at a picnic table in a state park in April of 1979, and she explained it slowly because she wanted them to understand it rather than just hear it. She said, "Imagine you have 2 dogs. They look different. Different size, different coat, different shape of head. But you sequence them and the genetics tell you they are the same species with different breeding. Now imagine you have 2 animals that look almost identical, and you sequence them, and the genetics tell you they diverged from a common ancestor a very long time ago, and then they evolved along parallel paths and arrived at nearly the same place by nearly the same route, but not quite. That is what Crossroads samples look like. The hair from the humanoid sightings came back with primate markers. Not human, but not distant from human either. Something in the neighbourhood of a hominid, with a set of differences that the laboratory could not place on any branch of the known family tree. The bird material, when they finally got some in 1975, came back avian, with a structure that suggested a lineage that had diverged from known raptors well before the current families formed. And the cow tissue in Rehoboth carried, in the wound margins, saliva from a mammal that the laboratory identified as canid, and then flagged, and then reran 4 separate times. Canid. Definitely canid. But not wolf, not coyote, not dog, not any canid on file. A canid whose genome contained adaptations that the laboratory described as consistent with a substantially colder and drier environment than any present in North America. Here is what that means, if you sit with it. These were not undiscovered animals hiding in a Massachusetts swamp. You cannot hide a 9-foot bird in 17,000 acres. You cannot hide a breeding population of 8-foot hominids in a wetland with hunters and hikers and helicopters and a state highway on 3 sides. That has always been the strongest argument against every cryptid in the world, and it is a good argument, and it is correct. But it is only correct if the animals live here. Wren's hypothesis, which she developed between 1975 and 1978, and which she was explicitly forbidden to put in writing, was that the animals do not live here. They live somewhere that is almost here, somewhere where the same evolutionary pressures produced almost the same animals, in a New England that stayed colder longer, or warmer longer, or never had the extinction event that took the teratons and the dire wolves and everything else at the end of the last ice age. And they come through. Not deliberately, not as an invasion, not as a mission. They come through the way a bird comes through an open window, because the window happened to be open and the bird happened to be flying. They spend hours or days in an unfamiliar forest. Some of them are seen, some of them are photographed badly, and some of them go back and some of them do not and die here and are never found, because a swamp is the single best place on the eastern seaboard for a body to disappear into. The same logic, Wren said, applies to the lights, and this is the part where I think the story is at its most quietly brilliant, because it takes the single most cluttered subject in the entire field of anomalous research and cleanse it in one motion. For 70 years we've been arguing about whether unidentified flying objects are extraterrestrial spacecraft. The argument has 2 sides and both of them are exhausted. One side says the objects are real, and the distances between stars are vast, and therefore whoever is flying them has crossed an ocean of light years to hover over a reservoir in Massachusetts and do nothing. The other side says the objects are misidentified aircraft and balloons and Venus, which is true a great deal of the time and unsatisfying the rest of the time. Wren's proposal removes the ocean. If the objects are not coming from another star but from another version of this planet, then there is no distance problem at all. They are not travelling far, they are travelling sideways, and the behaviour that makes no sense for an interstellar expedition makes perfect sense for a leak. Objects appearing and vanishing rather than arriving and departing, concentration in specific geographic regions rather than even distribution across a planet, sightings that cluster around geological features, machines that appear briefly, behave as though they are somewhere they did not intend to be, and disappear. Nobody is visiting. Things are falling through. The Bridgewater Triangle does not attract unidentified objects. It occasionally fails to keep them out. In the summer of 1979, Project Crossroads stopped watching and started digging. Wren was against it. She told the Bellamys this at the 5th meeting, and she was not calm about it, which was the only time in 14 months that they saw her lose her composure. She said that they had 25 years of observational data and no theory that could survive contact with it, and that the correct thing to do with a phenomenon you do not understand is to keep watching it until you do. She was overruled by people whose names she never learned. The drilling operation was staged as a municipal water project. I want to spend a moment on this, because this is the part of the story that feels most true to me, and it has nothing to do with structures or creatures. It is about how you hide a drilling rig. You do not hide it in the woods. A drilling rig in the woods is the single most interesting object in a county, and within a week there will be teenagers photographing it. You hide it by making it boring. You file a permit with the town. You put a notice in the local newspaper in the legal section, in 6-point type, about test wells for a proposed municipal supply expansion. You get an actual civil engineering firm to be the contractor of record, and you pay them properly, and they do actual paperwork. You put up a chain-link fence with a sign that has a phone number and a hard hat requirement. You run the rig during normal business hours, because a rig running at night is a mystery, and a rig running at 10 in the morning is an inconvenience. And then, Wren said, people complain about the noise and write letters to the town about the truck traffic, and nobody, not one person in 4 months, ever asks what you're actually looking for. That is the whole trick. That is how every one of these things is done, in every version of this story that has ever been told, and it is why the stories are plausible even when the contents are not. The rig went down through peat and clay and glacial till and hit the New England bedrock at just under 300 feet. Then it went through granite for 600 more. At 914 feet, the drill string stopped advancing, not slowed, stopped. The bit was a diamond core bit rated for hard rock, and it was turning, and the weight was on it, and it was not going down. They pulled the string and inspected the bit and found the diamond matrix worn flat, the way a bit looks after several hundred feet of hard granite, except this had happened in under 9 inches of progress. They ran a second bit, same result. They ran a third, of a different composition, with a different flush rate and a different rotation speed, and they got 11 inches and then nothing. Wren said that the engineering contractor, who had no idea what he was drilling into, told Kessler that the material at the bottom of that hole was harder than anything he had encountered in 30 years of well drilling, and asked, apparently sincerely, whether they had hit a meteorite. They gave up on penetration and went to observation. They widened the borehole enough to lower a camera. This was 1979. The camera was a downhole survey unit with a magnesium flare light source and a hardwired feed to a monitor in a trailer at the surface. And the picture was black and white and roughly as detailed as a photocopy of a photocopy. It went down for 11 minutes. There were 8 people in the trailer. Wren was one of them. The feed showed granite. Then more granite. Then a change in the rock, a zone of what she described as fractured and refused material, a sheath perhaps 40 feet thick where the bedrock looked as though it had been melted and allowed to cool. And then the bottom of the hole. The surface was black, not dark, not shadowed. Black, in a way that the camera's light did not change. She said that when the flare source came within a few feet, the surface did not brighten. It did not reflect. It did not scatter. The light simply arrived and did not come back. It was flat, absolutely flat, across the entire field of view, with no visible grain, no crystalline structure, no weathering, no pitting, and no dust. 900 feet down, in a hole that had been full of drilling mud and rock flour, sitting in a formation that has been under pressure since the Precambrian. No dust on it. They rotated the camera, and in the lower third of the frame, at the very edge of the light, there were marks. There were 16 of them visible in that pass, arranged in a horizontal band, each one perhaps 4 inches across, recessed into the surface rather than carved out of it. Wren said they were not writing. She was insistent about this, and her reasoning is the most interesting thing in the entire episode. Writing, she said, has statistical properties. Any human language written down produces a specific distribution of symbol frequencies. A few characters appear constantly, a middle group appears sometimes, a long tail appears rarely. This is true of English and Chinese and Linear B, and every undeciphered script that has ever been analysed. It is true because language is speech, and speech has structure, and structure leaves fingerprints. The marks on that surface did not have those properties. They had a different structure, and Crossroads analysts recognised it faster than they were comfortable admitting. The symbols were positional. They were, in the assessment that Wren gave the Bellamys, a coordinate notation. A system for specifying a location relative to some reference frame, using a base that the analysts eventually argued was not 10, and not 2, but something considerably larger. There were no verbs on that surface. There was no poetry, no dedication, no name of a king. There was an address. They dated the surrounding sediment. That work took 8 months, and it was done by 3 separate laboratories who were each given only a portion of the material and none of the context, which is a standard compartmentalization technique and also, Wren noted dryly, an excellent way to guarantee that nobody produces a coherent paper. The fractured and refused zone around the structure had been in place for a very long time. The estimates varied, and Wren gave the Bellamys the range rather than a single figure, because she was that kind of scientist. The most conservative reading put it at slightly over 11,000 years. The most aggressive put it beyond 30,000. Either way, the arithmetic is the same in the only way that matters. Whatever is under Hockomock Swamp was already there when the ice sheet retreated. It was already there before the Wampanoag, before the Paleo-Indian hunters who followed the caribou north across the tundra of what would become Massachusetts, before agriculture anywhere on Earth, before writing, before the last mammoth died on Wrangel Island. It predates every civilization that has ever existed on this continent, and it was buried. That is the detail that changed the character of the entire program, because things do not simply end up 900 feet down. Sediment accumulates, yes, but 900 feet of sediment and bedrock is not 11,000 years of accumulation. That is not a thing that happens on that timescale, in that geology. Somebody put it there, at depth, deliberately, inside the bedrock. Project Crossroad had not discovered an experiment. It had not discovered a crash, or a wreck, or a lost expedition. It had discovered infrastructure. Wren went back to the coordinates. This is the part of the story where she becomes, unambiguously, the hero of it, and I want to give her the credit she's owed even though she never existed. Everybody else on that program looked at the symbols and asked what they meant. Wren asked what they were for. She reasoned that if a set of positional notations is inscribed on the exterior of a buried structure, at a location on that structure that faced upward and outward, then the notation is not decoration and it is not a label. It is a sign. It is the thing you put on the outside of a building so that a person who arrives can find the entrance. She spent 4 months developing a mapping between the notation base and a modern coordinate system, using the structure's own centre as the origin, because she reasoned that a system describing itself would use itself as the reference point. She got 2 candidate solutions. One was in the middle of Buzzards Bay, under 60 feet of water, and made no sense. The other was 2.5 miles northeast of the drilling site, in the swamp, at a location that, when she pulled the pin map, sat inside the densest cluster of white tags on the entire board. They went in on the 4th of November, 1980. The entrance was not hidden in any dramatic way. It was under water, under peat, under a raft of cedar deadfall that had been accumulating for what was probably centuries, in a section of Hockomock that had never been surveyed because there was no earthly reason to survey it. They pumped for 9 days. Underneath, there was a shaft, circular, 14 feet in diameter, lined in the same black material, and descending along its inner wall was a helical ramp, cut at a grade that Wren described as comfortable, which is a strange word to use about an 11,000-year-old shaft, and which she used deliberately. Comfortable for something with legs, comfortable for something that walked upright. They went down 860 feet, and at the bottom, the shaft opened into a chamber that the survey team's laser rangefinder measured at just under 2,000 feet across, half a mile. Underneath a swamp in Massachusetts, in a state where the deepest thing anyone had ever built was a subway tunnel. The ceiling was a dome. The floor was flat and black and again entirely free of dust, in a sealed void that had been closed since before agriculture. And in the centre of that chamber stood the machine. Wren's description of it is the closest thing this story has to a religious document, and she gave it to the Bellamys in a diner in September of 1980, with her hands flat on the table and her voice completely level. It was a ring. A single circular structure, roughly 400 feet across, standing vertically, composed of that same black stone and threaded through with concentric bands of a metallic material that had not oxidized in 11,000 years. Inside the ring, more rings, at angles to each other, on mountings that suggested they were meant to move, and the same geometry repeated everywhere in the chamber, in the floor, in the ceiling, in structures along the walls that might have been consoles, or might have been supports, or might have been furniture. Circles inside circles. The engineers on the team began, immediately, trying to work out what the machine generated. That is what engineers do. You find a device, you ask what it produces. Power, heat, light, force, radiation. Wren stood in the middle of that chamber and understood, faster than anyone else, that they were asking the wrong question. The machine did not generate energy. The machine did not generate a field, or a beam, or a wave. She wrote it down that night in a notebook that Crossroad confiscated 11 months later, and Kessler apparently read the line and did not fully understand it, and she never explained it to him, and she explained it exactly once, to a small engine repairman and a school secretary in a diner off Route 24. She said, "It does not generate energy." She said, "It generates location." They turned it on 11 weeks later. I want to be careful here, because the word activation makes it sound like they found a switch, and there was no switch. What there was, according to Wren, was a set of bands on the inner rings that could be rotated by hand. By hand. 11,000 years underground, and the mounting still moved. She said that the first person who touched them, a young technician whose name she never gave, expected resistance and nearly fell over, because the ring rotated under his palm with the smoothness of a well-made door. There were markings on the bands, the same positional notation from the exterior surface, and it took Wren 4 months to understand what she was looking at, and when she did, she said, she had to go outside and sit on the ground for a while. The bands were a dial. The notation on the outside of the structure was not merely an address for the structure itself. It was an example. It was a demonstration of the format. It was the little diagram on the front of a machine showing you how to enter the number. Whoever built that chamber had left instructions on the outside of it, at the surface, facing up, in a notation that could be decoded by anybody who could count. And what those instructions said, in effect, was, this is how you specify where. Crossroad set the dials to the only coordinate they had, the structure's own, which is to say, on the 4th of February 1981, in a chamber half a mile under Hockomock Swamp, a group of American federal employees typed in the local address and pressed, in essence, here. 31 people were in that chamber. Wren was one of them, at a distance of about 300 feet, behind a barricade of sandbags that she described afterward as the most touching thing she had ever seen in her life, because there is something unbearably human about the instinct to stack sandbags in front of a machine that is 11,000 years old and works on principles you cannot name. The inner rings began to rotate. There was no sound. That is the detail she kept returning to. 400 feet of stone and metal moving at speed, and the chamber was silent, and the only way anyone knew the rings were moving was that they were watching them move. It took roughly 40 seconds, and then the walls went away. Not the ring, the walls. The chamber they were standing in stopped being a chamber. The dome above them, the black floor, the structures along the perimeter, everything except the machine itself and the ground beneath their feet, simply was not there anymore, and in its place was sky. Daylight. It had been 11 at night on the surface, in February, in a Massachusetts winter. They were standing in daylight, in what Wren estimated was late afternoon, in warm air, under an open sky. They were on a low rise, and in every direction there was forest. She said the geography was correct. That is the thing that undid several of the people who were there. It was not an alien landscape. The land had the same shape, the same low rolling contour of southeastern Massachusetts, the same drainage, the same distant rise where the Blue Hills should be, and the Blue Hills were there. The forest was not. The trees were enormous, conifers in the main, of a habit that no botanist on that team could place, with trunks she estimated at 6 to 8 feet across, standing in stands so dense that the ground beneath them was in permanent twilight. There was no cleared land, no fields, no roads, no power lines, no sound of engines, no aircraft, no contrails. Nothing on the horizon but canopy, all the way to the edge of sight. And in the distance, perhaps 4 miles to the northeast in the direction where Boston is, there was a city. It was ruined. She could see structures rising above the tree line, and she could see that the forest had grown up through them, and she could see that they were not intact, but they were unmistakably built, regular, vertical, arranged. She had time to notice that most of them were rectangular, and that several of them had peaked roofs. She had time to notice that they were made of stone, and then it closed. 17 seconds, from wall to wall. 17 seconds of another world, recorded on 11 cameras, 6 of which produced usable footage, and 1 of which produced the frames that ended Project Crossroad forever. The Bellamys saw those frames in March of 1981. Wren brought them. This was a firing offence at absolute minimum and probably something considerably worse, and she did it anyway. And when Elaine asked her why, she said that she had spent 2 years telling them things and she had reached the point where telling was not enough. She spread 6 photographs on the kitchen table. Gideon looked at the wide shots of the forest for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at the 4th photograph, which was a telephoto frame of the ruined city, taken by a camera on a tripod that happened to be aimed in the right direction, and he stood up so quickly that his chair went over backward, because he recognised it. Not the city, the building. In the foreground of that frame, at the near edge of the ruins, perhaps 200 yards from the tree line, there was a 2-storey structure of grey fieldstone with a peaked roof of dark slate and a chimney, with tall, narrow window openings, too many of them, at intervals that did not correspond to any interior arrangement, with a doorway that was, if you scaled it against the trees, almost 9 feet tall. They got Caleb's print out of the drawer. They put it on the table next to the photograph from the chamber. They were not the same building. Wren was clear about that, and so was Caleb once he had stopped shaking enough to look properly. The stonework was different. The chimney was on the other end. They were the same kind of building. The way 2 houses on the same street are the same kind of building. Caleb Bellamy had not hallucinated. He had not misremembered, or double-exposed a negative, or been overcome by swamp gas on a clear cold afternoon in October. For 20 minutes, by his watch, which never lied and never stopped, Caleb Bellamy had been standing in a different Massachusetts, at the edge of a forest that has not existed here since the ice, roughly 4 miles from a city that nobody in this world has ever built. He had walked out of one world and into another one, on a deer trail he had known since he was 9, and then, 7 hours later, on the same trail, he had walked back. The last thing Wren told them that night was the reason she'd come. It was not about the photographs. It was about a security camera. The chamber had been instrumented within an inch of its life. Beyond the 11 film cameras aimed at the ring, there were fixed video units covering the perimeter, the shaft entrance, and the equipment staging area, running continuously on a system that nobody reviewed in real time because nobody had the staff for it. The perimeter footage from the 4th of February was reviewed 11 days later, as routine. At the moment the walls went away, the perimeter cameras kept running, and they show something that none of the 31 people in that chamber saw, because all 31 of them were looking at the sky. At the eastern edge of the affected zone, at the boundary between where the chamber ended and the other world began, something walked in. It came out of the tree line at normal pace. It was tall. The analysts, using the ring for scale, put it between 6 feet 10 and 7 feet 2. Its shoulders were narrow relative to its height. Its arms were long. Its head was small and smooth. It crossed the boundary without pausing. It walked past 2 technicians at a distance of under 15 feet, and neither of them turned around. And the reason neither of them turned around, Wren said, is the reason she could not sleep anymore. It made no sound. Not muffled sound. No sound. It walked across the chamber floor at a normal pace, and it entered the mouth of the ascending shaft 11 seconds after arriving, which means it did not search for the exit. It knew where the exit was. Wren said the analysts spent 3 weeks on that 11 seconds of footage, and the conclusion in the final assessment was 1 sentence long, and it was the sentence that got the entire program shut down inside of a month. The assessment said, subject's movement indicates prior familiarity with the facility layout. They locked down the site. They searched the shaft, the chamber, the surface installation, the fence line, the swamp, and the roads. They ran dogs. They ran thermal. They kept it up for 9 weeks. They never found it. And the last thing Dr. Celia Wren said, on the last night the Bellamys ever saw her, standing on their porch in the March cold with her car running in the driveway, was that she had gone back and pulled Caleb's enlargement, the figure standing beside the building in the photograph. 7 feet tall, narrow shoulders, long arms, small smooth head. She had put the 2 images side by side under magnification and compared everything that could be compared, and the analysis was inconclusive because the enlargement was terrible and the video was worse, and no honest scientist would ever have called it a match. She said, "I cannot prove it is the same one." Then she got in her car, and then she rolled down the window, and she said the last thing she said, but it was watching him, 3 years earlier, on the other side. It stood 20 feet away and let him take a photograph and walk home. She said, and then it came here. She said, "I do not think that was an accident." Project Crossroad was terminated on the 6th of April 1981. The order came from Washington in the form of a single page, and Kessler read it standing up in the trailer at the drill site, and then he handed it to his deputy and went outside and stood in the mud for a while. The chamber was sealed. They did it properly, which is to say, expensively. They collapsed the upper 200 feet of the shaft with a shaped charge, and then they pumped several thousand cubic yards of concrete into what was left, and then they let the swamp come back, which took about 2 seasons because a swamp is extremely good at coming back. The borehole was grouted and abandoned in accordance with state well regulations, and the paperwork for that abandonment is, presumably, still on file in a municipal office in southeastern Massachusetts, correctly completed, correctly signed, and utterly meaningless. The instrumentation was pulled. The records were divided. That last one is the part that matters, and it is the part that I find most convincing, because it is not how a movie handles a cover-up, and it is exactly how an institution handles one. They did not destroy the files. Nobody burns files. Burning files is an act that has to be authorized, and the authorization is itself a file, and anyone who has ever worked inside a bureaucracy knows that the safest thing you can do with dangerous information is not to destroy it, but to distribute it. The Geological Survey data went to one agency, where it sits in a body of routine mineral resource material, and where any analyst who pulls it will see an unusual magnetic anomaly and a note about probable instrumentation error. The biological samples and the genetic assays went to a different agency, under a contract number, where they exist as an unresolved wildlife forensics case with no location data attached. The aerial phenomena reports went where aerial phenomena reports always go, and were assessed by people qualified to identify aircraft, and were closed as unidentified, which is the most boring word in the English language and has never once caused anybody a problem. The missing persons records stayed with local and state police because they had always been there. The chamber footage went somewhere Wren never learned, and the one document that tied all of it together, the pin map, the thing that made the pattern visible, the plywood board with thousands of holes in it that Caleb Bellamy had photographed in a construction trailer in December of 1978, was, according to Wren, photographed for the record, disassembled and disposed of. 4 sheets of paper. That is all it takes. If nobody holds all 4, nobody sees the shape. Gideon Bellamy asked Kessler one question, at the end, and Kessler answered it, and the answer is the reason I wanted to tell you this story. They were standing at the stone wall at the back of the pasture in April, with the swamp coming back to life around them, the peepers so loud they had to raise their voices. Gideon said, "So what happens now? Do you come after people who talk?" He meant himself. He meant his son. And Kessler laughed. Not cruelly. Wren said Kessler was not a cruel man, and I believe her, because the cruel ones are never the frightening ones in stories like this. The frightening ones are the competent ones. Kessler said no. He said, we would very much like people to talk. And then he explained the single most elegant idea in the entire architecture of this conspiracy, which is that the best way to hide something is not silence. Silence is expensive. Silence requires enforcement, and enforcement requires personnel, and personnel talk. Silence creates the appearance of a secret, and the appearance of a secret is the one thing that reliably attracts serious people. Noise is free. So you do not suppress the stories about the Bridgewater Triangle. You let them run. You let the newspapers print the Thunderbird sightings, and you let the paranormal societies come out on weekends with cassette recorders, and you let the college students drive out to Freetown at 2 a.m. to scare each other, and you let every author who wants to write a book about a haunted swamp write that book and sell it in gift shops. You let it become fun, because the moment a place becomes fun, it stops being investigated. Kessler laid it out for him at the wall, one item at a time. A bird with a 12-foot wingspan is a wonderful story, and it is also unfalsifiable, and it can never be pursued because nobody is going to fund a serious expedition to find a bird. A hair-covered humanoid is a wonderful story, and it comes with an existing global framework that is already saturated with hoaxes, so any new evidence arrives pre-contaminated. Ghost lights are a wonderful story, and there is a perfectly good mundane explanation involving marsh gas that every skeptic on Earth will deploy for free, without being asked, forever. Pukwudgies are a wonderful story, and they belong to a body of indigenous tradition that the surrounding culture has already spent 400 years learning to treat as legend rather than testimony. Every single one of those explanations, Kessler said, is a wall. And here is the part that got into Gideon Bellamy's head and stayed there for the rest of his life. Kessler said, none of it is even false. The stories are not lies. People really are seeing things. The reports are real. The witnesses are honest. Crossroad had spent 25 years confirming that the phenomena were genuine. The concealment was not in denying the events. The concealment was in leaving them in the categories where they arrived. Because as long as the bird stays in the cryptozoology drawer, and the light stays in the aviation drawer, and the missing hiker stays in the police drawer, and the dead cow stays in the veterinary drawer, then every one of those things has an explanation, and the explanation is boring, and boring things are not investigated. Only the map is dangerous, and there is only one map. Then Kessler put his hand on the stone wall and looked out at 17,000 acres of cedar and black water, and said the line that Gideon repeated to his children, and that his daughter repeated to hers. He said, nobody investigates folklore with a drilling rig. The Bellamys stayed. That surprises people, and I understand why. In the version of this story where the family is a device, they sell the property and move to Arizona, and the swamp becomes a thing that happened to them once. That is not what happens to people who have lived somewhere for 130 years. Gideon repaired small engines until 1994. Elaine ran the school office until she retired in 96, and she died in 2001 in a hospital in Taunton with her daughter beside her. Mara went to school in Rhode Island and became a hydrologist, which everybody in the family treated as a coincidence, and nobody actually believed was one. She has spent her career studying wetland systems, and she has never once, in 30 years of professional work, published anything about Hockomock Swamp. And Caleb did not sleep well again. He kept the photograph, he kept the enlargement, he kept the watch, which stayed 6 hours and 46 minutes behind for another 11 years until the mainspring finally went, and which is, as far as anyone knows, still in a drawer somewhere in Bristol County, keeping perfect time in a world that is not quite the one it was set to. He did not become an obsessive. That is the other thing this story does that I find quietly true. He did not spend 40 years on message boards. He did not write a book. He worked, and he married, and he had a daughter, and he was by every account a decent and slightly quiet man. But every few months, without discussing it, he would drive out to the road that dead ends into the conservation land, and he would park, and he would sit there for an hour or so with the engine off, looking at the tree line, waiting to see if the sound stopped. In the autumn of 1997, Caleb Bellamy found the family of Dr. Amos Vane. He had been looking in an unhurried way for about 6 years. This is the part of the story that could only happen in the era it happens in, because he found them the way you found. Anybody before the internet was any good, which is by writing letters to people with the right surname and waiting. Vane had died in 1988, at 70 years old, in a house in southern Rhode Island, of an ordinary heart attack in an ordinary October. His daughter was named Ruth. She was in her 60s. She had kept everything, because that is what people do with the papers of a parent who was quiet about his work, and she had never read most of it, because that is also what people do. She met Caleb in a public library in Westerly. She brought a cardboard box. Inside it were 7 field notebooks, a slide rule, a box of photographic prints, and a bound personal journal with a marbled cover. Caleb had come looking for information about Project Crossroad. He assumed, reasonably, that Vane would have known something. A man who finds the anomaly and then has his entire survey confiscated by 3 men from Washington does not simply forget about it. He was right about that. He was wrong about what he would find. Because the journal makes it very clear, in an entry dated the 11th of April 1954, 3 weeks after the confiscation, that Amos Vane had not been surprised by the anomaly under Hockomock Swamp. He had been looking for it. He had gone into that survey knowing something was there, and the reason he knew was sitting in the same box, in a manila envelope, in the form of 9 photographic prints that had been made from glass plate negatives, and a typed 2-page summary on letterhead from a civil engineering firm that ceased to exist in 1934. The excavation had taken place in the summer of 1921. It was not a research expedition. It was, in the most ordinary way possible, a drainage project. In the early 20th century, there was a serious and sustained effort across New England to drain wetlands. Wetlands were understood, at the time, as waste ground. They bred mosquitoes, they carried disease, they produced nothing, and the correct thing to do with them was to ditch them and turn them into pasture. Enormous acreages of American wetland vanished this way, and a great deal of southeastern Massachusetts was surveyed for exactly that purpose. A crew cutting a drainage channel on the southwestern edge of Hockomock in July of 1921 opened a void. The typed summary describes it in the most magnificently flat language imaginable, which is the language of a foreman explaining why he is behind schedule. The crew encountered a subsurface cavity of unknown origin. Work was suspended. The cavity was entered by 3 men on the 9th of July. It was a tunnel. The summary describes it as a passage of worked stone, roughly 8 feet in height, running approximately north-northeast, sealed at the far end by collapse, and containing, and I want you to hear the ordering of this list because the ordering is the whole thing, containing, quote, artifacts of colonial, Indian and unknown manufacture. Colonial, Indian, and unknown. The photographs are the reason Caleb Bellamy sat down on the floor of the Westerly Public Library. There are 9 of them. Glass plate. So the resolution is very good, better than anything Crossroad ever got out of a downhole camera in 1979. They were taken by magnesium flash, which is why the shadows are so black and the foreground is so bright. 6 of them are of the tunnel itself, and they show worked stone and courses and a ceiling, and they are extraordinary, and they are not the point. 3 of them are of a table. Somebody, in 1921, brought the objects out of that tunnel, laid them out on a plank table in the sun, and photographed them for the record, the way engineers do, because engineers document. The first table is colonial material. A buckle, a clay pipe stem, iron nails, hand-forged, of a type that dates comfortably to the 17th century. A fragment of a glass bottle. Perfectly ordinary. This is the kind of assemblage you can dig out of the ground almost anywhere in that part of Massachusetts. The second table is indigenous material. Projectile points. A stone adze. Pottery sherds with cord marking. Also entirely ordinary, and also entirely expected given that people lived in and around that swamp for thousands of years before any European arrived. The third table is not ordinary. There are 11 objects on it. 4 of them Caleb could not identify at all, and neither can I, and the summary describes them as fragments of unknown material. Dark, non-magnetic. 3 of them are clearly fabric, woven with a regularity of weave that is visible even in a 1921 photograph, and with a sheen that the summary describes as similar to silk but not silk. 2 of them are small, flat rectangular pieces, one of which has a row of what are unmistakably contacts along one edge. One of them is a section of tubing, translucent, flexible enough that it is photographed lying in a curve, and one of them is a wristwatch. It is lying face up on the plank in good light, and the photographer, bless him, took a close frame of it, because it was the only object on that table that he recognised as an object, and he wanted a proper record of it. You can read the dial, the summary, which was typed by somebody who had no idea what they were writing, and who described everything with the same weary literalism, includes a one-line inventory note about it. The note says, wristwatch, metal case, engraved reverse, and then it gives the engraving. Because that is what you do in an inventory, you record the markings. The engraving was a date, 1996. Amos Vane got hold of that material in 1949 through a chain of custody that his journal describes, and that I'm not going to reconstruct here because it is genuinely tedious, involving an estate sale, a retired engineer, and a filing cabinet in Providence. He spent 5 years quietly convincing somebody in Washington that a magnetic survey of southeastern Massachusetts would be a worthwhile use of federal money. He did not tell them why. And then, in March of 1954, he went and found the thing he already knew was there, and he wrote in his official notebook, "That is not geology," and he reported it up the chain exactly as procedure required, and 48 hours later 3 men took everything he had and made him sign a paper. He knew they would. That is the entry that Caleb Bellamy read 4 times in the library. Vane wrote, on the 14th of April 1954, that he had never intended to keep the discovery. He had intended to hand it to somebody with the resources to open it. He wrote that he had spent 5 years believing the tunnel objects were a hoax, and that he had gone to Massachusetts to prove it, and that he had come home unable to. And then he wrote the sentence that reframes the entire story. He wrote, "The watch is the wrong problem." He wrote that everybody who looked at that photograph became obsessed with the date, and the date is the least interesting thing about it. Because think it through. If you find a wristwatch engraved with a year that has not happened yet, sitting in a sealed tunnel alongside colonial nails and indigenous pottery, the obvious conclusion is time travel, and time travel is a satisfying explanation, and satisfying explanations are usually wrong. Vane's point was about the assemblage, colonial, indigenous, unknown, and modern. 4 categories of material, from 4 wildly separated periods, in one sealed void, in a stratigraphic jumble with no ordering at all. That is not what a time capsule looks like. That is not what a burial looks like, or a hoard, or a cache. Vane, who had spent the war listening to the ocean, and had a very good instinct for what the shape of a signal tells you about its source, wrote that the assemblage in that tunnel looked like exactly one thing. It looked like a drain. He wrote that if you have a mechanism that occasionally connects one place to another place, and if that mechanism has been operating intermittently and without supervision for 11,000 years, then small objects will come through it in both directions, constantly, at random, and they will accumulate at the low points. The tunnel was not a vault. It was the bottom of a slope. Things had been falling into it from everywhere and from every when, for as long as the machine had been running. Somebody's arrowhead, somebody's nail, somebody's fabric, somebody's watch. And Vane's last note on the subject, written in the margin in a different pen, presumably later, says the thing that made Caleb Bellamy close the notebook and sit very still in a public library in Rhode Island in the autumn of 1997. The margin note says, "If the watch came through, whose wrist was it on? Dr. Celia Wren. Found Caleb Bellamy in the spring of 1998. He had not been looking for her. He had stopped looking for her sometime in the mid-80s, after the 4th returned letter and the 3rd disconnected number. She wrote to him. The letter came to his house in Bristol County with no return address, containing a single sheet of paper with a date, a time, and the name of a coffee shop in Providence. She was 58 years old. She'd gone grey. She had, he said, exactly the same way of putting both hands flat on the table before she said anything difficult. She had not worked for the government since 1983. She had spent 15 years doing perfectly respectable contract work in geophysical instrumentation, which paid well, and which gave her incidentally access to an enormous amount of publicly available survey data from all over the world. And she had spent 15 years looking for the shape. Here is what she was looking for, and I want to explain the method, because the method is the reason I find this section of the story so effective. She was not looking for anomalies. Anomalies are everywhere. The Earth's crust is full of dense bodies and magnetic intrusions and things that make instruments misbehave, and every one of them has a perfectly good geological explanation, and almost all of those explanations are correct. She was looking for edges. The thing that had first caught Amos Vane in 1954 was not that the anomaly was strong, it was that it was bounded. It had a rim, geology grades, geology fades. Geology does not have a circumference. So Wren built a filter, and she ran it against every publicly available aeromagnetic and gravimetric survey she could get her hands on, and she spent 15 years doing it in the evenings. She found 11 candidates. She was careful about the number. She said that of the 11, 4 were probably impact structures, which produce circular signatures and are perfectly well understood. 2 were almost certainly volcanic. 1 was a data artifact from a badly flown survey. That left 4 she could not explain. 1 in central Scandinavia, under a lake, in a region of Sweden with an unusually deep folklore of vanishings. 1 in the Andean foothills, at altitude, in an area that had never been properly surveyed at ground level because nobody had any reason to. 1 in Central Asia, in a basin between 2 mountain ranges, in a place with a long tradition of stories about lights, and 1 in the Western Pacific, on the abyssal plain, in an area that appears in a great many marine anomaly reports and about which she declined to be more specific, on the grounds that the marine data was not hers. All 4 bounded, all 4 roughly circular, all 4 buried. She had no seismic confirmation for any of them. She was very clear about that. She had never had the resources to drill anywhere, and she never would. But she had done one thing that nobody else could have done, because nobody else had stood in the chamber. She had the coordinate notation. She had spent 2 decades working on it, from memory and from 4 photographs she had never returned, and she'd gotten far enough to understand that the notation was relative rather than absolute. It described positions with respect to a reference frame that the notation itself defined, which is how you would design a system if you wanted it to remain valid across enormous spans of time, because absolute positions on a planet are not stable. Continents move, poles wander, coordinates rot. And when she applied her decoding to the 16 symbols visible in that first downhole camera pass in 1979, she got something she had not expected. They were not one address, they were a list. She could resolve 4 of them with any confidence, and 2 of those 4 fell within the error radius of 2 of her candidate sites, which meant, if she was right, and she was extremely careful about the word if, that the thing under Hockomock Swamp was not a solitary object. It was a station. It had a directory of the other stations printed on its outside, and it had been sitting under a swamp in Massachusetts for 11,000 years, with the equivalent of a route map on its roof, waiting for somebody to be able to read it. Then Caleb asked her the question that everybody asks. He asked who built it, and Wren gave him an answer that he was not expecting, and that he spent the rest of his life turning over. She said that the entire time she was inside Project Crossroad, everybody, without exception, assumed the builders were not from Earth. It is the natural assumption. Ancient technology, impossible engineering, materials we cannot make, a device that opens onto another world. Of course it is aliens. That is what the word aliens is for. But Wren had stood in that chamber, and she said that the thing that bothered her, from the first hour, was that it fit. The ramp in the shaft was cut at a grade comfortable for a walking biped. The ceiling height was generous, but not absurd for something roughly 7 feet tall. The rings on the machine were mounted at a height where hands could reach them, and they turned with a resistance calibrated for arms. The chamber was lit, or had been designed to be lit, in a way that implied eyes. The notation was positional and used a base, which implies counting, which implies fingers, or something enough like fingers that counting felt natural. Every single design decision in that facility was made by something that walked upright, reached with limbs, saw with eyes, and counted. She said, "We kept saying it was alien." She said, "But nothing in that room was strange. Everything in that room was familiar." And so Wren developed the hypothesis that ended her career in every meaningful sense, and that she never published, and that she told to exactly one person in a coffee shop in Providence in 1998. She thought the builders were human, not from our past. She was clear about that. There is no lost human civilization 11,000 years ago with the capacity to sink half a mile of engineered stone into New England bedrock, and the archaeological record of that period is thin, but it is not that thin. We know what people were doing 11,000 years ago on this continent. They were following caribou. She thought the builders were human, and from somewhere else. Another version of this planet where the ice retreated earlier, or the extinctions went differently, or somebody had an idea 100 centuries before anyone here did, and where a civilization arose that eventually understood that its world was not the only one, and having understood that, did what human beings have always done, immediately and without exception, from the first raft to the first ship to the first rocket. It built a network, not to invade. Wren was firm about that too, and her reasoning was simple. If you can move between realities, then invasion is meaningless, because there is no scarcity. Nobody crosses an ocean of worlds to take a swamp in Massachusetts when there are infinite swamps. You build a network for the reason people always build networks, to connect. Stations, nodes, waypoints, placed in stable geology, deep enough to survive glaciation and continental drift, and whatever else a planet does over the kind of timescale a project like that would have to plan for. She said, "We did not find an artifact." She said, "We found a station on a line, and the line runs through worlds, and this station has been sitting here abandoned since before we could write." Caleb asked the obvious question. He asked, "Abandoned by whom?" And Wren said that is the wrong question too. She said, "Ask what happens to a station when nobody comes to maintain it." She said, "It does not stop." She said, "It develops a fault, and then it leaks." For 11,000 years, under a swamp in southeastern Massachusetts, an unmaintained doorway had been failing, not dramatically, not catastrophically, just badly enough that every so often, for a few minutes, the wall between one world and another went thin, and a bird came through, or a wolf that was not quite a wolf, or a light, or an object, or a boy on a deer trail with a camera around his neck, who stepped from one October into another one and did not notice the step. That is the Bridgewater Triangle. Not a haunting, not a curse, not a landing site, not a spiritual vortex, a broken machine in the basement that nobody has come to fix. And then, in that coffee shop in Providence, Dr. Celia Wren told Caleb Bellamy why she had written to him. She said, "There is one more thing, and you are the only person alive who has any right to know it." She said, it happened in October of 1981. The site had been sealed for 6 months. The shaft was concrete. The instrumentation had been pulled. The trailers were gone, the fence was down, the permits were closed, and the swamp had already started doing what swamps do to anything left alone, which is to reclaim it thoroughly and without ceremony. Crossroad no longer existed. But 16 magnetometers do not simply evaporate, and one of them, at a monitoring station on the western edge of the wetland, was still on a data line to a facility in Maryland because somebody had failed to submit the decommissioning paperwork. That is the whole reason anyone knew. A clerical error. On the night of the 29th of October, 1981, that single surviving instrument recorded a magnetic distortion that exceeded the largest event in the entire 25-year record by a factor of somewhere between 40 and 60. The exact figure was never determined because the instrument saturated. It went off the top of its own scale and stayed there for 11 minutes. Wren got a phone call at her apartment at 11:40 at night from a man she had worked with for 9 years who was not supposed to call her and who said 8 words and hung up. He said, "It turned itself on. Get in the car." She drove up from Maryland through the night. She got there at 10 in the morning, and by then there were 19 people at that site, none of whom officially worked on a program that no longer officially existed, which is a sentence I want you to sit with for a moment, because it describes how a very great deal of the world actually works. Kessler was there. He looked, Wren said, 10 years older than he had in April. Here is what had happened in the region overnight, and this part is the part I find genuinely frightening, because it is the only part of the story that ordinary people experienced. Power failed in portions of 4 towns between 11:11 and 11:22 at night. The utility recorded it as a fault of undetermined origin and never located the cause. Telephone service was disrupted across a wider area. Livestock in at least 6 properties broke fence. In 2 cases, the animals were found miles away in the morning standing still facing east. A driver on a state highway reported that his car died and his headlights went out, and that the woods on both sides of the road were, in his words, lit up orange from underneath. The state police logged 11 calls that night. Every one of them was closed as a power outage. And in the swamp, the machine that Project Crossroad had sealed under 200 feet of collapsed shaft and several thousand cubic yards of concrete had opened its door. They could not get down to it. That is the first thing Wren wanted to be clear about. Nobody went back into that chamber in 1981 or ever, because the way down no longer existed. But they did not need to get down to it, because on the night of the 29th, the effect did not stay underground. 7 of the 19 people who assembled at that site had been present in the region overnight. 2 of them had been standing at the edge of the swamp at 11:15, and what they described, and what 4 of them independently drew on separate sheets of paper before they were permitted to speak to each other, because Kessler was thorough even at the end, was that in a section of Hockomock swamp roughly a mile east of the old Bellamy pasture, the forest changed. Not a light this time, not a glow, a boundary, a vertical edge running through the trees perhaps 400 yards long, on the near side of which was a Massachusetts swamp in late October, cold, grey, half bare, and on the far side of which was daylight and warmth and forest. The same forest from the chamber, the enormous conifers, the twilight floor, the canopy going all the way to the horizon. And this time it did not last 17 seconds. It held for 11 minutes. Wren said that the 2 men who were standing there did not approach it, and she said she had never once judged them for that, and neither do I. They stood approximately 90 yards back, at the edge of the pasture, in the dark, in the cold, and they watched a doorway into another world stand open in the woods behind a dairy farm in southeastern Massachusetts, and after roughly 4 minutes, figures came out of the trees on the other side. There were, by the closest count anyone could give, somewhere between 20 and 40. They were human, not humanoid, not figures, human, and both men were emphatic about it, and both used the same phrase in their statements, which was that they looked like people you would not notice. They wore equipment, harnesses, packs, something over the lower face on several of them. Nothing that looked military in any way either man recognised, and nothing that looked ceremonial. They came out of the tree line at a walk, and they stopped about 40 yards short of the boundary. They did not appear surprised. That was the detail that broke both men. They said it separately in almost the same words. Whatever else they had prepared themselves for in 25 years of a program built around the possibility of contact, they had not prepared for the other side to be bored. The people on the other side stood there in a loose group and looked across, the way a road crew looks at a hole in the pavement. Then one of them walked forward. He came to within perhaps 10 yards of the boundary on his side. He raised one hand, palm out, which is either the oldest gesture human beings have or a coincidence so enormous that it amounts to the same thing. And then he spoke. The two men heard him clearly. Sound crossed. That was one of the 11 findings in the assessment, and it is a strange thing to see in an official document, the observation that sound crossed. He spoke English. It was accented in a way that neither man could place against any accent they knew, and the rhythm was wrong, and some of the vowels were long where they should not have been. But it was English. He said, "You should not have opened this one." One of the men, whose name Wren gave and which I am not going to repeat, called back and asked who they were. The man on the other side ignored it. He said something about the door, using a word that neither listener could reproduce, and then he said, quite clearly, "This station is closed." And then the other man, the one who had been silent, shouted the question. He shouted, "Who built this?" And the stranger on the far side of the boundary stopped. He looked, both witnesses said, confused. Not evasive, not cautious. Confused, in the specific way of a person who's been asked something so obvious that he suspects he has misheard it. He looked back at the group behind him. Then he looked across again, and he said, "You did. That is the sentence. That is the sentence that 30 years of a classified program, and a drilling rig, and a chamber half a mile underground, and a family on the edge of a swamp, and a boy with a camera all arrive at. You did." Then something happened on the other side. The group behind him moved. Whatever they were wearing over their faces went up. Two of them turned back toward the tree line at a run. There was a sound, and both witnesses described it identically, and neither could describe it well. And the best either of them managed was that it was low, and it was not mechanical, and it came from the forest. The stranger turned around, and in the deep shade under those enormous trees something moved. Both men said the same thing about it, which is that they could not see it, and that they could see where it was, because the branches were going high up, considerably higher than the tops of the trees on the Massachusetts side. The stranger looked back over his shoulder at the boundary one more time. Then the doorway closed. Not slowly, not with light or sound or any of the theatre that this story has had up to that point. It simply stopped being there, and there was a cold October swamp in front of them, and 11 minutes of the strangest thing any human being has ever witnessed was over. Wren said that the two men stood in that field for another 40 minutes before either of them moved. She said that no reading was ever taken again at that site. She said that the surviving magnetometer was collected on the 3rd of November by two men she did not recognise. And she said that in the 18 years since, whatever else she had failed to understand, she had never once managed to stop thinking about the fact that the man on the other side had been irritated